If it's wet and mushy and slimy, add more carbon. If it's very dry, sticky, hard, not very broken down, add more nitrogen. Hey, what's up y'all? This is William, the Permaculture Consultant, and today we're going to be talking about 3 reasons your compost, your hot compost, failed. Now, before we get into that, if you have any permaculture Q&A questions or compost questions, then leave them down below in the comments with the hashtag permaculture Q&A at the beginning of them. Also, if you need any consultations, hit the links down below. Let's get started. Now, this is the most common reason right here. The majority of the times people's hot compost fails is because their pile isn't big enough. Now, this is a brand new pile that I just started, and it's about, I want to say it's like 44 inches tall. This ring that I have is 4 feet, 3.5, 4 feet in diameter. This I know gives me, if I fill it all the way to the top, after it shrinks down a little bit, because it's always going to shrink down a little bit. It was all the way up to the top, and now it shrunk down to about this square right here. I know that I need at least 1 cubic yard in order to provide enough housing for all of the microbes that I'm trying to grow in this compost pile. Many people do it about half this size. They start with about half this size, and it never heats up. Or if it does heat up, it doesn't stay heated up for very long, maybe just the first or second flip, and then after that it just dies. Now, there is a limit on how big you can make your compost. This is about 1.25, 1.5 cubic yards right here. There is a limit on how big you can make it though in this hot composting method. You can do like huge cold composting methods with no issue, but with this getting so hot, what happens is in the center, it gets really, really hot and it starts producing, it goes anaerobic and it starts producing alcohols. And then those give off vapor, and at about 175 degrees, which this can get to no problem at all, those vapors can then spontaneously combust, light everything on fire, and then there you go. Hopefully you don't have this by your house. So don't do anything over 3 cubic yards with this hot composting method, and don't do anything under 1 cubic yard with this hot composting method. I find that the best results come when I'm getting closer to that 3 cubic yard side. Once I'm hitting like 2.5 cubic yards, that's when this stuff really starts breaking down very, very quickly. With each one of these problems, I'm going to give you guys the solution. If you started making your compost and it's not heating up and you realize you probably didn't add enough material, just add an equal amount of browns and greens to your pile, add plenty of water, and then start flipping it again. Incorporate, like restack it in this cage, put down a layer of carbon, like a new brown, put down a layer of this, a new green, a layer of this, a new brown, a layer of this, and cap it off with a layer of carbon on top. So if you didn't do enough the first time, just use that as material in your next compost pile. Now, the next reason your compost probably failed is because of your ratios. And this one, I understand it takes a little bit to understand and a little bit to get used to, but you want to make sure your ratios between, if you're using manure, greens, and browns, make sure that those are correct. That's why I like using these wire cages so much, is because each square kind of gives me a visual representation of what percentage that material is taking in this pile. So that way, like in these videos and in these piles, I usually alternate layers just because it's easier to understand how much is going into it visually, and it's easier to teach you guys how much of each ingredient is going in here. As you can see, I have the carbon, green, there is a super high nitrogen core in here, but it's just carbon and green over and over, or brown and green over and over again. Like if you're noticing that it's real, like nothing really broke down very much, and it might be a little bit crunchy when you flip it, or like crinkly when you flip it, if you're hearing those sound effects, or if you're noticing that there's it's real sticky, or like I said, nothing's really broken down, then you might not have added enough nitrogen. In that case, just add nitrogen. Could be fresh green weeds, it could be anything like that. If you're noticing that your compost pile is slimy and like just like real super tacky, stays really wet all the time, and just kind of falls apart in your hands, then you didn't add enough carbon. And in that case, just add more carbon. Now, one of the reasons that people get their ratios off so much is because they don't understand, like whenever they're harvesting their green, they're not taking into consideration in which season that they're harvesting. So for example, I just did a permaculture Q&A the other day where somebody was asking me if they can compost their mustard plants. Absolutely, you can 100% compost your mustard plants, but in her case, they had already gone to seed. Early on in a plant's life, especially an annual plant, early on in that plant's life, it's very, very high in nitrogen. It's like an explosive, it's explosive growth. It's trying to get up there as fast as possible so it can get to the stage where it can reproduce seeds. The closer it gets to reproducing seeds, the higher in carbon it's going to be because it has thicker walls, thicker cell walls, more carbon in the actual structure of the plant and all that stuff. An example of high nitrogen greens is this clover, for example, or grass that has not gone to seed yet. Clover is going to be higher in nitrogen than grass, but they're right next to each other, so I might as well show you guys the example. Now this grass right here has already gone to seed, so I know that if I'm trying to use this grass as a green in my compost pile over there, then I need to use a higher percentage of this because it's providing less nitrogen versus this clump of grass right here, which has not gone to seed. So making sure that you're aware of what season or what stage of growth your plant is in when you're harvesting it for greens can help mitigate some of those ratio issues. Another issue that I see is when people buy their carbons. Like you can see down this row, I tried that straw bale method, by the way. It just got taken over by the clover. So I was using straw as the walkway on this pathway. The clover just took over, so I'm just using it for compost now. But one of the issues I see with messing up your ratios on carbon is that like some people will buy a compressed version of whatever carbon that they need if they're buying a carbon. But they're not like rehydrating it completely whenever they throw it in the compost pile. So they throw it in the compost pile, it's still very much compressed. It just looks better than it did in the bag. And as that becomes rehydrated, as more water gets incorporated into that pile, they realize like, oh, what I thought was just 40% carbon actually ended up being 80% carbon because it all decompressed and expanded and stuff like that. So keep those in mind. Ratios on your compost pile are a very, very big deal, and they're a little bit tricky to understand. If it's wet and mushy and slimy, add more carbon. If it's very dry, sticky, hard, not very broken down, add more nitrogen. Now, the third most common reason that people's composts fail is because of the water management. Water management is another thing that is a little bit tricky to understand, and it's not going to be the same answer for every person. Depending on your environment, like arid environments are going to have to add more water more consistently than a temperate or humid environment. We're very, very humid right here. In fact, I was about to die until this wind started blowing. But this compost right here, I added, basically as I was adding ingredients, every time I added ingredients, I was adding a ton of water. I was trying to completely saturate it in the beginning stages. And hopefully with that, that's all the water that I need to add. If I need to add a little bit more, then I will do so, but it's best to try to add it all at the beginning. Now, how do you know if you have enough water? If you take a handful of it and you squeeze it as hard as you can, you should get one singular drop to fall from that pile. Some ways to know if your pile has too much water is if it has actinobacteria growing in the center of it. Let's say you've already done your first flip and you're waiting on your second flip, and you crack it open, and in the center of it is a bunch of white, not fuzzy, not stringy, but there's just a bunch of white stuff in the middle of your pile. That's actinobacteria. That's an indicator that you have too much water in your pile, and you need to do something to change that. Now, most of the time, the solution to that is to just flip your pile, because you're reintroducing oxygen into the pile, and that's going to hopefully get rid of the actinobacteria. Now, if you're getting a handful of it and it's just completely dripping, like it's a constant stream coming out of that little handful, then you're going to want to add a chimney to the center of your pile, like I showed you on this pile over here somewhere. I don't remember which flip it was, but I showed you guys in that playlist. You're going to want to add a chimney to your compost pile. Now, avoid using PVC as a chimney in your compost pile, because anywhere that plastic comes into contact with your compost is going to go anaerobic. So you want to try to eliminate the amount of anaerobic spots you have in your pile. So instead of using PVC, just stick your pitchfork handle down in the center of it, wiggle it around until you have a chimney. And if that's not working, if that's not getting rid of enough moisture, add another chimney. So also, if you're realizing that your compost pile is too dry, just keep adding water. Like if you're doing the chicken tractor on steroids method, or if you're in an arid environment, then I would recommend having two people work on the compost. One person is flipping it and the other person is constantly spraying that new flipped compost pile the entire time, just constantly spraying it, especially if you're in an arid environment. But the chicken tractor on steroids method, if you're unfamiliar with it, the chickens help you make the compost, but they break the compost piles down completely before you're ready to flip them again. So they're really, really drying out quite a bit. I was just going to do 3 reasons why your compost is failing, but this is also another important reason, so this will be just a little bonus here at the end. The last most common reason that your compost isn't working is because of contaminated or polluted materials. Now, as best I can, I try to harvest all the materials off this property or very close proximity to this property. But if you're buying bagged carbon sources, for example, then you might be getting, like some of this, I do have some bagged straw in here, not very much, but you might be getting what's called like pesticides or herbicides along with it. Grazon was a horrible one that stopped seeds from germinating, and that was in quite a few products a couple of years ago, if not last year. But contaminated sources, and that includes your water. So I'll go through each section and talk about each contamination that could possibly occur. With the carbon, there's a lot of herbicides and pesticides, especially if you're buying carbon, that could potentially be sprayed on there that's going to, you know, inhibit the growth of these microorganisms. Your greens, those typically are cleaner sources. Usually you don't have to worry about too many herbicides or pesticides or anything like that on your green sources, because they're coming from, like, if they're coming from the like lawn clippings and grass clippings and somebody uses like herbicides and pesticides on that and it's rained since they've used that, then chances are the grass is a pretty clean source. I should also say a very clean source of carbon is always going to be tree leaves. So keep that in mind. But yeah, your green sources are typically easier to find that are going to be clean. Your manure sources, I would avoid using sources of manure that are gonna be high in dewormer or antibiotics. So where you have to worry about that is with goats and with horses. Those are the most common ones that use dewormer and antibiotics, is, you know, stuff like that. So those will inhibit your compost piles. And lastly is the water. If you're using, let's say, city water and it's filled with chlorine and chlorinate and fluoride and all that stuff, all of that is going to inhibit your compost pile as well, and it's going to delay how quickly your compost pile heats up. So keep those things in mind. Hopefully I provided solutions for everything that you guys had issues with. If you have any permaculture or compost Q&A questions, then leave them down below in the comments, and thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you.